At 80 years old, I decided to burn every single photograph I'd ever taken. Every memory, every face, every moment. But as the flames consumed the past, one photo remained in my trembling hands, and what it revealed shattered me more than any fire ever could. Edward Collins had spent a lifetime capturing memories. As a professional photographer, he had dedicated decades to freezing time. Weddings, births, anniversaries, and everything in between. Every click of the shutter was his way of preserving life, creating an archive of fleeting moments that he believed would last forever. Now, at 80, those memories were all that remained. His house was cluttered with stacks of old photographs, black and white portraits of people who had long since passed away, color prints of weddings where the couples were now divorced, and candid snapshots of children who had grown up and moved on. But it was the photographs of Helen that haunted him most. Helen had been Edward's first muse, his first love, his everything. They met in their 20s, a chance encounter at a park where Edward had been taking photographs of a couple and their baby. Helen, with her bright blue eyes and mischievous smile, had walked right into the frame. "Are you trying to steal my soul?" she had teased, laughing as Edward blushed behind the camera. That photograph was the first of many. Edward spent decades capturing Helen in every moment, dancing in the rain, sitting by the window with a book, holding their newborn daughter in her arms. Each picture told a story, a chapter of their life together. But then, Helen got sick. The cancer came swiftly, like a thief in the night. One day she was laughing, baking cookies in the kitchen. The next, she was lying in a hospital bed, her eyes hollow, her hands cold. Edward took one last photograph of her on a rainy afternoon. Helen was standing by the window, staring outside as the rain streamed down the glass. Her face was half hidden in shadow, her expression unreadable. It was the last photograph he ever took. After Helen died, Edward couldn't bear to look at those photographs. But he couldn't let them go either. Instead, he buried himself in them, letting the memories consume him, one picture at a time. Years passed. Their daughter, Lily, visited less frequently. She had moved to another state, too busy with her own life to worry about her aging father. Edward understood. After all, what did he have to offer now? Just a dusty old house filled with memories that no one wanted to remember. The house became a mausoleum. Rooms that once echoed with Helen's laughter now sat in eerie silence. The kitchen, where she had baked cookies and sang along to the radio, was covered in a thin layer of dust. The garden, once blooming with roses Helen had lovingly tended, was now a tangle of weeds and overgrown grass. Edward's days became a monotonous cycle. Wake up, drink stale coffee, shuffle through old photographs, fall asleep in the armchair by the window. His only company was the relentless ticking of the clock and the haunting eyes staring back at him from every framed picture. Until one rainy afternoon, when Edward decided he couldn't take it anymore. The rain pounded against the windows, much like the day he took that final photograph of Helen. Edward sat in his living room, surrounded by boxes of photos. They were everywhere, on the floor, stacked against the walls, piled high on the coffee table. The weight of those memories pressed down on him like a boulder. Each photograph felt like a reminder of a life that was no longer his. A life he couldn't touch, couldn't hold, couldn't bring back. And in that moment, the thought struck him. What if he let it all go? What if he burned every last photograph, erased every memory, and freed himself from the prison of his own mind? The idea was terrifying, unthinkable. But as Edward looked around the room, at Helen's eyes staring back at him from every frame, at the countless faces of people he no longer remembered. He felt a surge of determination. He would do it. He would burn them all. Edward stood up, his knees creaking, and began gathering the photographs. He moved methodically, stacking them in piles, sorting them by size and era. Wedding photos, baby photos, holiday photos. All of them would go. He dragged a large metal trash can into the center of the living room and placed the first stack of photographs inside. His hands shook as he struck the match, the tiny flame flickering in the dim room. Edward hovered the match over the pile, his heart pounding. Could he really do this? Could he erase every memory he had spent a lifetime collecting? His eyes fell on a photograph at the top of the stack, a candid shot of Helen laughing, her hair tousled by the wind, her eyes shining like stars. Edward's chest tightened. He almost pulled the match away. But then he remembered how Helen had looked in that hospital bed, her once bright eyes clouded with pain, her voice a faint whisper. He couldn't hold on to her anymore. Not like this. The match fell from his fingers, landing on the pile of photographs. The flame licked at the edges of the paper, curling the corners, blackening the images. Edward watched as Helen's face crumpled and twisted in the fire, her laughter turning to ash. One by one, the photographs burned. The wedding photos, the baby photos, the Christmas photos. All of them turned to blackened scraps of paper, the smoke curling up toward the ceiling like lost souls. Edward's eyes stung from the smoke, but he couldn't look away. It was both agonizing and cathartic, a release and a loss. When the flames finally died down, only one photograph remained. It lay at the bottom of the trash can, half burned, but still intact. The edges were charred, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. Helen standing by the window on that rainy afternoon, her face half hidden in shadow. Edward reached down, his hand trembling as he lifted the photograph. The rain outside continued to pour, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat. Edward stared at the photograph, his breath hitching in his throat. Why had he kept this one? Why hadn't he burned it along with the others? His mind drifted back to that day. The rain, the cold, the smell of antiseptic in the hospital room. Helen had asked him to take that photograph. "I want you to remember me like this," she had said, her eyes distant. "Not as someone who's dying, but as someone who's still here." Edward clutched the photograph to his chest, the edges digging into his palms. Hot tears streamed down his face, mingling with the rain that leaked through the window frame. For the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to grieve. Not just for Helen, but for the life they had shared, the life he had tried so desperately to hold on to through these photographs. And as the rain continued to fall, Edward sobbed into the empty room, holding on to that one last photograph, the only memory he couldn't bring himself to burn. Edward Collins sat motionless on the floor, the charred remains of countless photographs surrounding him like a field of wilted petals. The metal trash can was still warm, its interior blackened with soot and ashes. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt paper, a scent that clung to his clothes, his hair, his skin. But in his hands, he held the one photograph that refused to burn. Helen, standing by the window, rain streaming down the glass, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the camera lens. The image was haunting, a moment suspended in time, a memory that refused to be destroyed. The edges of the photo were singed, curling inward like a dying leaf. But Helen's face remained intact, her expression unreadable, her gaze distant. Edward's hands shook as he stared at the photograph. He could hear the rain outside, echoing the downpour from that fateful day. It was as if the storm had never stopped, as if time had looped back to that exact moment, the moment when everything changed. The day the photograph was taken, Helen had already received her diagnosis: terminal cancer. The doctor's words had fallen like stones, each syllable heavy and cold. Helen had sat silently in the passenger seat on the drive home, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing rain. When they arrived home, Helen went straight to the window and stood there, staring out into the gray, misty world. Edward, unable to bear the silence, picked up his camera, the same camera he had used to capture every milestone of their life together. He pointed the lens at Helen. But this time, she did not smile, did not turn to face him. Instead, she kept staring out the window, her shoulders tense, her jaw set. "Helen," Edward said, his voice barely a whisper. "Take it," she said, her voice firm. "Take the picture." Edward hesitated. This wasn't the way he wanted to remember her, not as a woman already half gone, her spirit heavy with unspoken fears. But he did as she asked. He pressed the shutter, the sound echoing in the quiet room like a gunshot. Click. Helen remained at the window for hours, unmoving. Edward had left the photograph on his desk, too afraid to look at it, too afraid to confront the truth that Helen was already preparing to leave him. Now, sitting alone in the living room, Edward pressed the photograph against his chest, as if trying to absorb the last remnants of Helen's presence. Tears streamed down his face, hot and relentless. "What were you looking at?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "What did you see out that window?" But the photograph offered no answers. Helen's gaze remained fixed on a world that Edward could not see, a world that lay somewhere beyond the rain. Edward pulled himself to his feet, his knees groaning in protest. He stumbled over to the armchair, collapsing into it. The room was dark now, the only light coming from the smoldering remains in the trash can. Shadows flickered across the walls, creating the illusion of faces in the smoke. Helen's face, her eyes hollow, her mouth open as if to speak. Edward squeezed his eyes shut. The memories came rushing back, uninvited and unforgiving. The hospital room was cold, sterile, suffocating. Helen lay in the bed, her skin pale against the white sheets. Machines beeped softly, a mechanical lullaby that only heightened the silence. Edward sat by her side, holding her hand. It was so light, so fragile, as if even the slightest pressure would shatter it. Helen's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. "Helen," Edward said, his voice thick with fear. Helen's eyes fluttered open. They were dull, unfocused, as if she were staring through him. "I keep seeing that day," she whispered. "The rain, the window." Edward's heart clenched. "What about it?" Helen's eyes drifted to the ceiling. "I wasn't looking at the rain. I was looking at you." Edward blinked, his throat tightening. "Me?" Helen nodded weakly. "You were holding the camera. I wanted to remember you, the way you looked at me, like I was still me." Edward's grip on her hand tightened. "You are still you." Helen's lips quivered, a single tear escaping down her cheek. But not for long. Those were the last words she ever said to him. Edward opened his eyes, gasping for air. The memory had been so vivid, so real, as if he were right back in that hospital room, holding Helen's fading hand. He looked down at the photograph again. The edges were still smoldering, tiny tendrils of smoke curling up into the air. Helen's face was blurred by a small burn mark, as if the fire had tried, and failed, to erase her. Edward traced a trembling finger over her face, his heart aching. "You were looking at me," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "All this time, I thought you were looking at the rain, at the world outside. But you were looking at me." A sob tore through him, raw and unrestrained. Edward doubled over, clutching the photograph as if it were the last remaining piece of Helen. For so long, he had convinced himself that Helen had already left him before she died, that she had withdrawn into herself, into some place he couldn't reach. But now, he understood. She hadn't withdrawn. She had been trying to hold on to him. The tears kept coming, each one washing away another layer of grief, another layer of guilt. Edward cried for everything he had lost, for the love he had taken for granted, for the time he had wasted drowning in the past instead of living in the present. When the tears finally subsided, Edward sat up, wiping his eyes. The room was silent, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the windows. The storm had returned, as if the world were mourning with him. Edward looked down at the photograph, now smudged with ash and tears. He knew what he had to do. Slowly, he rose to his feet and crossed the room to the fireplace. He placed the photograph of Helen on the mantel, positioning it carefully so it faced the window, the same window where Helen had stood, the window where she had looked at him one last time. Edward stepped back, his heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. He had tried to erase the past, tried to burn away the memories, but the truth was, he couldn't let go. Not yet. And maybe, he thought, he didn't have to. Maybe holding on to this one photograph, the last one, the one where she was still looking at him, was enough. Edward sat back down in the armchair, his eyes never leaving the photograph. The rain continued to fall, the soft, rhythmic sound lulling him into a state of calm. Outside, the world was still dark, still stormy. But inside, in that tiny room filled with the scent of ashes and the warmth of lingering love, Edward Collins finally felt a flicker of light. The rain had not let up. Outside, the world remained shrouded in a heavy, relentless downpour, as if the sky itself were grieving alongside Edward Collins. He remained in the armchair, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Helen resting on the mantel. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single table lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Edward could not shake the memory of Helen's final words. "I was looking at you." The realization gnawed at him, burrowing deep into his soul. For all these years, he had convinced himself that Helen had retreated, that she had withdrawn into herself, leaving him behind to grapple with the emptiness. But now, he understood. She had been reaching out to him, trying to hold on to the last fragments of their life together. Edward pushed himself up from the chair, his knees cracking as he stood. He approached the photograph, his hand hovering over it, as if touching Helen's face through the glass. The burn mark at the edge of the picture was still visible, a dark scar marring the only image he had left of her. He traced the outline of her face with his finger, feeling the tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. How many moments had he wasted drowning in bitterness, cursing the world for taking Helen away? How many days had he spent hiding in the shadows of his memories, instead of embracing the life he still had left? Edward's shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. He knew what he had to do. Edward walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a worn cardboard box labeled Helen's Things. The tape was brittle, the corners frayed. It had been years since he had opened it, too afraid to confront what lay inside. He carried the box to the living room, placing it on the coffee table. His hands shook as he peeled back the tape, revealing the contents: old letters, postcards, a few pressed flowers, and a small leather-bound journal. Edward picked up the journal, the leather cool and soft against his fingertips. Helen had always carried it with her, jotting down thoughts, ideas, and bits of poetry she loved. He had never read it, respecting her privacy. But now, it was all he had left, the last words she had ever written. Edward opened the journal, the spine creaking from years of disuse. The ink had faded in some places, but Helen's handwriting was still unmistakable, flowing, elegant, every letter crafted with care. April 15th. The day I found out today, the doctor said the words I never wanted to hear. Cancer. It's like the ground has been ripped out from under me. How do I tell Edward? How do I tell Lily? How do I even breathe? Edward closed his eyes, feeling the sting of tears. He remembered that day vividly. How Helen had come home pale and shaken. How she had avoided his eyes, claiming she was just tired. He had known something was wrong, but had been too afraid to press her. April 20th. Edward, I can't stop looking at him. Every time he walks into the room, I feel like I'm seeing him for the last time. I don't want to tell him. I want to keep pretending that we have more time. But the clock is ticking, and I can feel the days slipping away. Edward's hands shook as he turned the page. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind? May 5th. The photograph. Edward took my picture today. It was raining. He didn't know, but I was looking at him. I wanted to remember the way he looked at me, the way he always did, like I was the only person in the world. The pain was bad that day, but seeing him with that camera, so focused, so intent, it made me feel alive. Edward pressed a hand to his mouth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The photograph. She had asked him to take it, not for her, but for him. She had known she was dying, and she had wanted to leave him something. A memory of the way he had loved her, even in those final terrible days. The journal fell from Edward's hands, landing on the floor with a soft thud. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing openly. The walls seemed to close in around him, the room spinning with the weight of all the lost moments, the unspoken words, the love he had failed to express. For years, he had held on to bitterness like a shield, using it to protect himself from the crushing grief. He had blamed the world, blamed fate, blamed everyone but himself. But now, sitting amidst the ashes of his memories, he could no longer hide from the truth. I'm sorry, Helen, Edward whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Hours passed. The rain continued to pour outside, a steady, rhythmic beat against the windows. Edward remained on the floor, surrounded by Helen's things, the journal, the letters, the last photograph. His body ached, his eyes burned, but for the first time in years, he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. Edward reached for the photograph, holding it up to the light. The burn mark still marred the corner, but Helen's face remained clear, her eyes still fixed on him, as if she were seeing right through the years of pain and regret. I couldn't let go, Edward said aloud, as though speaking to her. I couldn't move on. But you were right, Helen. You were still there. You never left. Edward rose to his feet, clutching the photograph tightly. He walked to the fireplace and placed it on the mantel, right where it had been before, a place of honor, a place of remembrance. He stood back, staring at the photograph as though seeing it for the first time. The house was still empty, still silent, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place of memory, a place where Helen still lingered, her presence as real and tangible as the rain outside. That night, Edward lay in bed, the journal clutched to his chest. The house creaked and groaned in the wind, but for once, the sound did not frighten him. It was comforting, like a lullaby. Before drifting off to sleep, Edward closed his eyes and whispered, "I remember now, Helen. I remember everything." And in the darkness, he felt her hand in his, warm, steady, and forever intertwined with his own. Morning arrived quietly, the rain having ceased sometime during the night. The house was bathed in a soft gray light, and the air carried a chill that seeped through the windows. Edward Collins awoke with a start, his body stiff and aching from sleeping on the floor. The leather-bound journal still lay beside him, its pages open to Helen's last entries. Edward sat up slowly, rubbing his sore neck. The photograph of Helen remained on the mantel, her eyes eternally gazing out of the window, the burn mark like a scar across the corner. It was the only photograph he had kept, the last tangible connection to Helen that he could bear to hold on to. Edward pulled himself up and shuffled into the kitchen. The room felt emptier than usual, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the silence. He filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove, his mind replaying Helen's words from the journal. "I wanted to remember the way he looked at me, like I was still me." Edward gripped the edge of the counter, the words echoing through him like a haunting refrain. How had he not seen it? Helen had been holding on to him, even in those final days, and he had been too lost in his own grief to notice. The kettle whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that snapped Edward back to the present. He poured the hot water into a cup, dropped in a tea bag, and carried it to the living room. The scent of chamomile filled the air, the tea Helen always drank to calm her nerves. Edward lowered himself into the armchair, the journal balanced on his knee. He took a slow sip of the tea, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. His eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantel. For years, he had been drowning in memories, unable to let go of the past, unable to move forward. But now, with Helen's words lingering in his mind, he began to wonder, had he really been remembering her, or had he been using those memories to avoid living in the present? The house felt colder than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Edward set the tea down and picked up the journal, flipping to the last entry. The ink was slightly smudged, as though Helen's hand had trembled as she wrote. June 12th. The last day. Edward doesn't know it yet, but today will be the last time I see him. The pain is getting worse. I can feel it spreading, like fire under my skin. But when he looks at me, he still sees me, not the illness, not the pain. Just me. I want to remember his face like this, his eyes so full of love, his smile so full of life. If I could, I would stay here forever, just staring at him. But I can't. I hope he knows how much I love him. I hope he remembers me like this, not the woman in the hospital bed, but the woman by the window, still holding on. Edward closed the journal, his breath hitching. How could he have missed it? Helen had been trying to tell him all along, through her words, through her eyes, through that last photograph. She hadn't wanted to be remembered as a dying woman. She had wanted to be remembered as herself, strong, vibrant, still fighting to stay connected to him. Edward stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. He walked to the mantel, and took the photograph down, cradling it in his hands. The edges were still burned, the paper warped, but Helen's eyes remained as clear and piercing as ever. A knock at the door startled him. Edward set the photograph down carefully and made his way to the front door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Lily standing there, her eyes red and swollen, a look of worry etched across her face. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking. "I've been calling you for days. Are you okay?" Edward blinked, confused. "Days?" Lily stepped inside, glancing around at the disarray. The ash-stained trash can in the living room, the empty teacup on the floor, the journal lying open. "What happened here?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Edward's shoulders slumped. "I was cleaning up." Lily's eyes landed on the photograph of Helen, the only one that had survived. She walked over and picked it up, her fingers tracing the burn mark. "You kept this one," she said softly. Edward swallowed hard. "It was the last one I took of her." Lily nodded, her eyes glistening. "I remember that day. She told me she wanted you to take her picture. She said she wanted you to remember her like that, still looking at you." Edward's knees gave way, and he sank into the armchair, his hands shaking. "Lily, I was so blind. I thought she was pulling away from me, but she wasn't. She was holding on. She was holding on for me." Lily knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. "She loved you, Dad. She never stopped. And she wouldn't want you to keep punishing yourself like this." Edward looked down at his daughter, her eyes so much like Helen's. The same shade of blue, the same warmth. "I burned them all, Lily," he said, his voice breaking. "All the photos, except this one." Lily squeezed his hands gently. "Maybe that's all you needed. Just one. Just one to remind you of who she really was." That evening, after Lily had left, Edward sat alone in the living room, the photograph of Helen resting on the coffee table. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the house. Edward picked up the journal and opened it to the last entry again. He read the words over and over, letting them seep into his mind, his heart. Then, he placed the journal next to the photograph and stood up. There was still a box of old letters in the closet, letters Helen had written to him throughout their marriage. Edward pulled the box out and carried it to the armchair. He opened the first letter, dated decades ago, and began to read. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed, but Helen's words were still as vibrant as the day she had written them. In every letter, she spoke of love, of longing, of moments shared. Each word was a piece of her, a fragment of the life they had built together. Edward read until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. The walls no longer echoed with silence. They hummed with the sound of Helen's words, her laughter, her love. As the sun rose, Edward placed the letters back in the box, his heart lighter, his mind clearer. He walked to the mantel and placed the photograph back in its place. Helen's eyes continued to gaze out the window, her expression serene, as though she were still waiting for him to notice her. Edward reached up, brushing his fingertips over her face, his heart swelling with both love and loss. "I see you now, Helen," he whispered. "I see you." The dawn light seeped through the blinds, casting soft golden stripes across the living room. Edward Collins sat quietly in the armchair, the photograph of Helen resting on his lap. The house was silent, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt full full of Helen's presence, her words, her love. For hours, Edward had sat there, reading through Helen's letters, each word a window into her mind, her heart. It was as if she were still here, whispering to him through the ink on the page. In those letters, Helen had poured out her fears, her dreams, her memories, things she had never said aloud, things Edward was only now beginning to understand. Edward traced a finger over the photograph, his eyes fixed on Helen's face. The burn mark on the corner was still there, but it no longer bothered him. It felt like a part of the story, a scar, a reminder of the pain he had tried to burn away. But now, he didn't want to erase it. He wanted to hold on to it, the pain, the memories, the love. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, pulling Edward from his thoughts. He placed the photograph back on the mantel and stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He hadn't expected anyone. When he opened the door, he found Ruth, his neighbor from across the street, standing there. She was holding a small potted plant, a sunflower, its bright yellow petals like a burst of sunshine against the gray morning. "Edward," Ruth said, her eyes soft and warm. "I hadn't seen you in days. I just wanted to check in." Edward offered a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just sorting through some things." Ruth nodded, her gaze drifting to the living room behind him. "I heard about the fire," she said gently. "Are you sure you're all right?" Edward swallowed, his eyes lowering to the floor. I was trying to let go." Ruth stepped forward, placing the sunflower into his hands. "Sometimes, we try so hard to let go that we end up holding on even tighter," she said. "Maybe it's not about letting go. Maybe it's about finding a way to live with it." Edward's eyes stung, tears threatening to spill. He looked down at the sunflower, its petals vibrant and full of life. Helen had loved sunflowers. She said they reminded her of hope, always turning toward the sun, even on the darkest days. "Thank you," Edward said, his voice breaking. Ruth touched his arm lightly. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm just across the street." Edward nodded, watching as she walked away. He closed the door and carried the sunflower to the living room, placing it next to the photograph of Helen. The two seemed to belong together, the sunflower reaching toward the light, and Helen staring out the window, eyes soft and distant. Later that afternoon, Edward made himself a cup of tea and sat down at the small writing desk near the window. The journal lay open beside him, Helen's words etched into his mind. He picked up a pen, the ink dark and fresh against the page, and began to write. "Dear Helen, it's been a long time since I've spoken to you like this. Maybe too long. For so many years, I thought you had left me. I thought you were already gone long before you took your last breath. But now I see it. You were still here. You were holding on, trying to stay with me, trying to remind me that you were still you. I tried to burn the past away. I thought that if I erased every memory, I could finally stop feeling the pain. But the pain never left, Helen. It just buried itself deeper. Now, I don't want to forget. I don't want to let go. I want to remember. All of it. The good, the bad, the beautiful, the painful. Because that's what we were, right? We were all of it. I miss you, Helen. But I see you now. I see you in the photograph. I see you in the sunflowers. I see you in every letter you wrote to me. And I promise, I will keep you alive in my heart, not in the ashes of the past. Love always. Edward set the pen down, his heart heavy yet strangely light. The words felt like a release, a confession, a prayer, a vow. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it between the pages of Helen's journal. The next morning, the rain had finally stopped. The air was crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant blue. Edward stepped outside, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. For the first time in months, he felt the urge to go for a walk. He walked down the street, passing houses he hadn't noticed in years. The world seemed new, sharper, brighter, as if he were seeing it through Helen's eyes. When he reached the park, he sat down on a wooden bench, the same bench where he had first met Helen all those decades ago. Back then, she had been a young woman with wild curls and a laugh that echoed through the trees. Now, the bench was just a bench, empty, weathered, a relic of a time long gone. Edward pulled the photograph from his coat pocket. Helen's eyes looked back at him, gentle, knowing. "You were looking at me," Edward said aloud, his voice soft. "All this time, I thought you were staring into the rain, into the distance. But you were looking at me." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above him. Edward closed his eyes, letting the breeze wash over him, feeling as though Helen were sitting beside him, her hand resting in his. For years, he had been trapped in a cycle of grief, trapped in memories that had become more like ghosts than gifts. But now, he understood. Helen hadn't wanted him to forget. She had wanted him to remember, but to remember with love, not with pain. Edward stood up, slipping the photograph back into his pocket. He looked up at the sky, the sun breaking through the clouds, and took a deep breath. It was time to go home. When Edward returned to the house, he picked up the journal and placed it carefully back in the box labeled Helen's Things. But he didn't seal the box this time. He left it open, accessible, a living part of the house, not a relic buried in the past. The sunflower Ruth had given him sat on the windowsill, its bright petals reaching for the light. Edward touched one of the petals, feeling its softness, its fragility. He picked up the photograph of Helen and placed it back on the mantel. But this time, he didn't feel the ache of loss. He felt warmth, love, and the undeniable presence of the woman who had loved him fiercely until her last breath. Edward took a step back, his eyes lingering on the photograph. Helen's eyes seemed to follow him, her gaze still tender, still full of love. "I see you now, Helen," Edward said, his voice steady. "And I promise, I won't forget." Outside, the wind carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming flowers. Edward stood at the window, feeling the sun on his face, and smiled. The world was still turning. The sun was still shining. And Edward Collins was still here, still alive, still holding on, still remembering. Edward Collins stood in the center of his living room, a sense of calm washing over him. The photograph of Helen remained on the mantel, its edges still slightly charred, but her eyes were clear, looking at him, not through him. The house, once suffocating and filled with ghosts of the past, now felt like a place of warmth, of life. The sunflower that Ruth had given him blossomed on the windowsill, its petals bright and reaching toward the light. Edward sat down in the armchair, the same chair where he had spent countless hours lost in grief. But today, he wasn't drowning in the past. Today, he was present. He reached for the box labeled Helen's Things, the lid open, the letters inside neatly stacked. The pain was still there, yes. The ache of loss, the sting of regrets. They would never completely go away. But now, they no longer felt like shackles. They felt like reminders, reminders of a life well lived, of a love that had been deep and real and everlasting. Edward closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I remember you, Helen," he whispered, "and I always will." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm golden glow over the room. Edward opened his eyes, leaned back in the chair, and smiled. Because for the first time in years, he felt truly, undeniably alive.